Thank you, Amber. First of all, thank you everyone for attending. I know there are a bunch of sessions around this time frame, and so the very fact that you chose this one means a lot to me. I really appreciate that. If you are familiar with me at all, you most probably know me due to my association with the Apache Software Foundation, which I co-founded and actually served on the board for almost 2 decades, up until like 2018 or so. I've been heavily involved with open source since very from the beginning. And so in many ways, this will be an introductory to open source, some of the historical perspectives, both subjective and objective as well. As I mentioned earlier on, if you have any questions during the presentation, please don't hesitate to ask. I will save some time towards the end for Q&A, but I like having dialogues rather than monologues. So again, even though we're virtual, it still make this as free and as agile as possible. So let's talk a little bit about the prehistory of open source. And by prehistory, I mean basically before 1999, 1998. Back then, software was really not, I wouldn't say a valuable resource, because it was valuable, but it wasn't a valuable as in costly resource. It wasn't something that people needed to worry about, buying or licensing or things of that nature, because really at that period of time, it was all about the large machines. It was all about the mainframes. In many ways, these mainframes were the software dongles of the early computer ages. So the value, the expense was actually in the owning and running of the computers and not so much in the software itself. But what we saw earlier on in those days is that if you were lucky enough and fortunate enough and maybe rich enough or whatever to be able to afford these really heavy machines, these and the people to do it, the software itself that was used were usually shared among many people outside there. So even before there was this concept of open source or free software, there was sharing of software out there among universities, among companies. I mean, BSD is most probably the best example of that, where in addition to the AT&T System 5 Unix alternatives in there, you had the BSD, the Berkeley Software Distribution, running along in parallel on various systems platforms out there. And so BSD has that heritage. There was really open source and the whole concepts of open source early on the days, even when it wasn't called open source back then. And really, when you looked at it, a lot of the infrastructure associated with the internet was based on what we would call nowadays open source software. So the file sharing protocols of FTP and Gopher, for example, sending email back and forth with a SendMail or SMail or QMail. The DNS system, bind, and just the the actual software itself to run the internet. These were all freely available, freely modifiable, and they encouraged people that became to actually contribute to these software projects. It wasn't until we saw this migration from the large mainframes to mini computers, to microcomputers, to even PCs, that software started becoming a much more of a valuable resource. As the hardware got cheaper, software became, I wouldn't say more expensive, but became a viable alternative to make expense, to make revenue. It became possible now to make a business around selling software because the audience for that was much larger. And so software became much more expensive, and by making it much more expensive, it became much more proprietary. You could make it expensive by selling licenses to it. It was around this time that the free software movement and the GNU organization kind of came around. Now, it's important to remember that for this particular case, what the free software movement was all about was software freedom being a moral imperative, that software needed to be freely available to people, that it was really all about the license. It was really all about the availability of the license in all cases. And so it really moved around the idea of these four fundamental freedoms, which were defined and critical in the whole aspect of what created and what moved free software. Now, because of the use of the word free, some people think, hey, does it mean free as in a free lunch or free beer? And it means free as in free speech. And there's some confusion about that sometimes. And so that's the reason why some places the word libre is used. And you actually see free software sometimes called FLOSS, F-L-O-S-S, for free, libre, open source software. It was about in 1998, 1999 that as much impact as the free software movement had, there were aspects of it that people found restricting, including the moral imperative aspect of it, the conceived ideas that taking something which was free software and closing it up and making it proprietary was not allowed, was not something that should be encouraged. And so the open source initiative created itself in 1998 with the ideas that what we're really concerned about is open source as an entity, 10 conditions, 10 criteria that a license must have for it to be considered an open source license. And these are the 10 out there. And you'll see that many of these do not restrict in any way the taking of these software resources and closing them up, making them commercial, making them proprietary, something which is very, very different from the concepts of freedom in the Free Software Foundation. So again, we're seeing that most of the software was really moving towards software that was really much more of an open source flavor rather than a free software flavor, even though around this time, the terms were used interchangeably. But what really kicked off the success of open source and the open source success movement, I think, are two things. First of all, was the rise of the World Wide Web. I mean, this was what really moved the internet and internet technologies away from academia, away from businesses, away from governments, in towards businesses, in towards users, into the consumer industry inside there. And that took quite a period of time. Some people remember there was actually an acceptable use policy inside the internet very, very early on that said that you couldn't use it for commercial purposes. It wasn't until the World Wide Web came on board that these changes started happening. So I think that was one of the major reasons why open source became much more popular. The second thing was the LAMP stack: Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. This was really the first opportunity where people realized that you could take a software stack that was completely open source, and most of the time under a very permissive or a weak copyleft kind of license, and create a business around it, create an entire infrastructure around it that allowed you and your business to really play with the big boys and have as much power, have as much authority, have as much visibility as the people who had unlimited funds. The LAMP stack can't be minimized as far as one of the main reasons why open source succeeded in the world. Now, around this period of time, because there was success inside of open source, there came the rise of what's called FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And the concept behind that is because this whole concept of sharing information, this whole concept of software being available under an open source license and collaboration being the rule of the day, was seen as a threat to existing software companies whose entire business was built around having closed source proprietary software, either applications or operating systems, and selling licenses to those software out there. I mean, this was back in the day when Microsoft had referred to Linux and open source as the great cancer. it was seen as something very, very bad, that it was going to be something that needed to be destroyed because of the threat that it imposed to this proprietary software service model. And as we'll see, and as we all know, that has really, really changed nowadays. From a company that, as I said before, claimed that open source was a cancer, to now one of the biggest proponents of open source. The change in Microsoft is due to the real value and the real properties that open source brings to the table when you start talking about software development. Now, really, let's dive a little bit deeper into the concepts of open source. Now, in general, something cannot be considered open source. It can't be an open source product or an open source project unless it is under an open source license. I mean, that is really one of the main criteria of any open source project. And it's important to remember that because the way copyright is written, once you create something, it is immediately under copyright. You have to explicitly put it under a license for it to be available under an open source license. So just because something is available under GitHub, for example, if there's not an explicit license associated with that, you really don't have the access and the rights to it that you would think. So always make sure that there is a license associated with the software project that you're using, because that's the only guarantee that you have that it really is an open source project. And in general, there are three main types of open source licenses out there. The first are the permissive licenses, which basically say you can do anything you want with it, just give us credit. These are the MIT BSD licenses, the Apache license, for example. There's also the weak copyleft licenses, which are like the Eclipse public license and LGPL, which basically says, you need to give us, if you distribute the software with fixes, you need to provide those fixes to us. And finally, there's the strong copyleft that says anything that your software, that a GPL software uses and becomes part of a larger distributed work, that needs to be available under this strong copyleft license as well. So really, again, the main takeaway for this is that licenses is important. If it's not under an open source license, it is not an open source project. That's it, full stop. But the biggest addition to availability under an open source license, and Josh Simmons did an excellent job earlier today at his keynote talking about this, is that what's very important about it and what really drives the success of open source is not necessarily the license, but what the license provides, which is the ability to create a culture around this open source asset, to be able to create a community around a software code base. This is what it allows. This is what makes the drive of innovation inside of open source, is this focus on community. So yeah, even though something may be under an open source license, if it doesn't have that sense of community inside there, it's really doing itself and the code base a disservice. It really is about empowering people to contribute and collaborate in these open source projects. And this is where the source of innovation comes from. So really, open source is about creating an environment and a culture that drives collaboration among people. And this can only happen when there is full transparency, not only in the decision-making process, but also in how the code is handled, in the governance process, about what the features need to be happening, what the roadmap looks like, what issues and bugs need to be looked at. This is one of the reasons why in many, many cases, you'll see that asynchronous communication, such as email, is used really heavily in successful open source projects. And it's not because the people behind it, are really fans of older technology, but email and other asynchronous communication patterns are really good at, first of all, because they're on public mailing lists, it drives the sense of transparency. It also doesn't disenfranchise people who may be located in different time zones. For example, you send an email out and you can wait for it. Whereas if you send something on IRC or Slack or via Zoom or whatever communication method you're talking about before, you're necessarily being favorable towards people who happen to be in the same time zone as you, or have the same flexibility and freedom as far as time is concerned. So really, this is what not drives that. I love analogies and metaphors. I think they're a great way of looking at it. And I think what really makes open source is important. The license and the community can really be driven home by this analogy. And I really want to give credit to Mark Hinkle, who was the first one to really make me think of this analogy. Think of beer, okay? Back in the day, all neighborhoods, or most neighborhoods in cities, had their own local beer flavors outside of there. And what do we see happen? Well, there was this consolidation of breweries, such that you had now like 2 or 3 large mega conglomerates who would provide beer. And what was the reaction to that in the community about people who really, really were serious about beer? Well, the microbrew industry. You saw these small companies pop up to be able to provide alternatives to people. The same with music. When you start looking at such musical, realms such as hip hop and jazz and punk and grunge, what were these? These were really a revolution against the commercial, mass-produced, bloodless, passionless medium that was produced for us by some entity who thinks it knows better, instead of actually being crafted by us. Open source is really a return to the hacker culture that was so prevalent several decades ago. The idea of a beautiful hack that you could then share with other people and people could improve upon. In a lot of ways, it's also very, very similar to the scientific method and how we do, drive innovation in science and in health, where it's only by making this information public, by making the ability to share the information and build on top of it, which really drives the technological advances you see in health, which drive the advances you see in science. Well, this is how you're doing advancement and innovation inside of software, is by using and leveraging open source. Now, one thing that needs to be incredibly clear is that all contributions are useful. All contributions are vital to the success of open source and open source communities. It's not just code. Now, we still have a long way to go regarding that's concerned. There is in 1984, no, not 1984, Animal Farm, and the other George Orwell book, all pigs are equal, but some pigs are more equal than others. And there is still in some communities this idea that if you produce code, if you contribute code, you're somehow more of a valuable community member than if you do other things. And that's just simply not true, okay? All contributions are vital. Diversity and inclusion is incredibly critical to the long-term health and viability of any ecosystem, whether it's a biological ecosystem or whether it's a software, a development ecosystem. You need additional insights. You need different worldviews. You need all kinds of contributions to make this continue on. The reason why open source in a collaborative consensus-based action is really the main keys to success that we're seeing, and those are the open source projects that people are really going towards, is because they know they have a long-term viable solution out there, that they're going to be there for the long run. And that's only possible if you have a healthy, viable, diverse, and inclusive community. Now, why do people contribute to open source? Why is it something that people will volunteer their time to do? Well, there are a couple of reasons. First of all, is that it gives you the ability to have impact and influence on software that really is world changing. I mean, as much of a cliche as that is, how often do you get a chance to do something on a volunteer time which really impacts the world or huge swaths of the population and can make the world a better place? So there's a lot of personal satisfaction people get out of doing that. Another thing is this sense of community, become a viable, important part of the community out there. So there was this old meme that, software developers are isolated people who spend their time down in the basement in their underwear under, almost no lights at all, hacking away. And that's definitely not true. What we see is that open source is a recognition that software developers, all contributions and all contributors are artists. And as artists, you want to share your skills, you want to hone your craft, and you want to work with like-minded people. But why do companies also are into open source? Why? What's the advantage for them? Well, first of all, is the security aspect of it. Because open source is baselined around the idea that the source code is shared and the development process is extremely transparent. It's got a much higher level of security inside of there. So the availability and the feasibility of backdoors and things of that nature is significantly reduced. And also, there is the many eyes meme where as many people who are looking at it, bugs are really found and squashed much more quickly. And in general, open source is much more performant than closed source solutions out there because it needs to address a wider range of audiences, a wider range of environments out there. Another reason why companies use open source is it allows them to try things, become much more agile, not as agile development process, but agile as in quickly changing, quickly pivoting, quickly refocusing their energies on different ideas and different solutions based on what's going on. If you had to do that based on closed source proprietary software that you had to buy, license, get up to speed, you wouldn't be able to do that. So it really allows you the ability to try something new and fail fast, which goes back to what Jeff was talking about in his talk about failing something good. That's how you learn. Well, by leveraging open source inside of a company, you're enabling yourself to be able to try things out, figure out what works, and fail fast and come up with the right selection. And also, if you are a company that leverages open source, and as long as you are a really good contributing member of that open source community out there, okay, you are able to enjoy an incredibly tight, positive feedback loop where the people that you are working with are also the people who may be your users, your contributors, your potential employees, your potential partners. That tight feedback loop is incredibly successful and incredibly important to providing business value for those associations. And finally, by focusing your internal developer resources, and I'll be just talking about software right now, but by focusing your internal developer resources on the stuff that provides the secret sauce to the company, the things that differentiate the company, the things that provide value to the company, that's how you provide innovation. That is how your company moves innovation. By leveraging open source where it's possible, you're able to focus those talent and skills on things that really make the company move forward. So what we're seeing here it is, it's the 21st century, 2021, and we can point to countless blog reports, conferences, sessions that says open source wins, right? I mean, that's certainly the case. After all, open source was the basis of Web 2.0. It's the basis of Web 3.0, the decentralized community out there. You can't think about big data without the impact that open source has provided to it. Big data wouldn't be a thing if it wasn't for the open source projects that basically implemented that. Machine learning and AI are also heavily based and heavily dependent upon the open source software projects that define that. Blockchain, the whole, again, the centralized distributed aspects associated with it. Again, this is an important aspect. Open source is driving this chain. Microservices, even that idea itself is really important and critical in the idea of open source. Open source is driving microservices and driving DevOps. There really isn't a technology area, even FinTech and FinServ. really isn't a technology area that isn't impacted and driven by open source outside there. In fact, what we're even seeing now is companies are taking the lessons learned of how to build and run successful open source projects and moving that internally. Instead of the agile development method, scrums and stuff like that, they're instead running their internal projects as if they were open source projects, the concept called inner source. So we're seeing that open source is not even driving technology, driving innovations inside of different infrastructural realms. It's actually changing how companies are building software themselves. And of course, you can't look at any company. I mean, we're familiar with the quote tech companies which are using open source, and they wouldn't be anywhere near where they are now if it wasn't for open source. But really, at the end of the day, all companies are realizing that they are tech companies, and open source is important and vital to their set. It really is worldwide. So open source wins, obviously, of course, right? Well, does it? Does open source win? I mean, what we've seen over the last couple of days is here it is, we're like 1 yard from the goal line, and we seem to be taking some steps back. For example, right now, there is this drive towards what I call hype-driven, other than tech-driven design, infrastructure, architecture. Hey, why are you baselining this particular software project? Why are you baselining this open source project? Oh, because everybody is. Okay, that's really not what open source was about. Open source was to enable you to make your own decisions, be masters of your own destiny, to make the decision based on yourself, because it was basically no cost to try different things. It was focused on the technology rather than the hype associated with it. We've also seen the return of FUD lately, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, in many ways related to business models associated with it. The idea that for some reason, open source is not compliant or not viable with a business model nowadays. If you want to build a company around open source and open source solutions, you have to change things. You have to change the license now. There was the issue with the Commons Clause, which was basically an add-on that was usually added on top of the Apache license that said, oh yeah, this is under the Apache license, but there's this additional addendum that immediately made the software no longer open source. But if you weren't familiar with that, if you weren't really tracking and being aware of what was going on, you would think it was open source. You've been seeing also the push of various new license and licensing models out there, specifically designed to make you think that this is an open source solution, but really it's not. It's designed to give you that false sense of assurance, give you that false sense of the good housekeeping seal of approval, the false sense that this is an open source project under an open source license run in a communicative, collaborative culture, when it really isn't. They're really trying to redefine the principles that were successful for open source. Open source wasn't successful despite these principles that they're fighting against. Open source was successful because of the principles. And so by redefining those, you really do a disservice to everything out there. Another thing that we've seen, and I'm so glad that Josh talked about foundations at his keynote, was this idea of facade foundations. Foundations only work when they become really, really neutral entries for communities and people and individuals and corporations to all collaborate together in a very, very equal, cohesive places. But what we've seen is that some people in some places and some corporations and some projects have created this idea of a facade corporation. So yeah, it looks like it's being run by an open source foundation, but when you look at it, it really isn't. It's more of a walled garden. That you still have no more freedoms over it, that only the company who is the head of the foundation controls the roadmap, controls who can contribute, can control which contributions are accepted and which ones aren't. And the increase of pay to play, that yeah, if you want to join and be a willing partner and collaborating on this open source project, well, you better have deep pockets and a really, really big wallet, because the more say you have is fully dependent upon how much money you pony up into these foundations. Again, this is all going against the idea that open source is about controlling your own destiny, controlling your own skills, having the awareness to make those decisions for yourself. Okay, this is what the history of open source has provided to us. We need to keep the revolution going, and it is a revolution. You know, there wouldn't be as much a FUD and pushback from it earlier on if it wasn't, and there wouldn't be existing pushback on it right now if it wasn't. I think one of the biggest things that we need to seriously think about and seriously consider is that those of us from my generation, and I mean the open source generation, is that we have a duty. We really have a serious duty to foster the new generation. And that's one of the reasons why I love the All Things Open events, and especially the Open Source 101 events, is because this kind of fostering, this kind of mentoring, this kind of education can't be found anyplace else. Okay, the situation has changed. There is an upcoming generation that thinks that simply because, and I'm not picking on GitHub, you know, for any pick, but just because something is on GitHub, that's how you do open source, okay? Without thinking about the community aspects of it, about not thinking about the whole idea about how do you work together as a community associated with it. What are the reasons for an open source license being the way it is? These are lessons learned that it took a while for the people of the first generation to move and drive. And it really is a disservice to the movement and to the up and coming generation if we don't foster the new generation coming up. So my call to duty, in addition to learning more about open source and finding an open source project that you really want to get involved with, is that if you are one of the first or primal generations of the open source movement, be a mentor, share that knowledge, share that enthusiasm, really let people know the passion that's inside of you, be a mentor. And if you're someone just starting, find a mentor, find a project that speaks to you. Because I promise you that the impact of open source isn't just about the software, it's about the personal connections you make, it's about the personal growth that you make, that in addition drives open source and software innovation. So join in, don't stop, do what you can, and enjoy, have fun with what you're doing. That's it for me. I've got a little bit of time, maybe about 5 minutes or so left for some Q&A. If you have any Q&A, that would be great. I will be putting these slides up on SlideShare. If you want to follow me, that's my Twitter, Jim Jag. That's my Twitter handle down there. And obviously, you know, the slides but all of this is being recorded, which is fantastic as well. So really, I encourage you to ask any questions if you have them. If not, if you think of something after the fact, my email is jimjag@gmail.com. Don't hesitate to reach out and contact me. You can always, again, follow me and DM me on Twitter. My DMs are wide open. I'll stop right here. If you have questions, we got about 5 minutes or so to address them. If not, I hope you stay on with the Open Source 101 event. This is really a fantastic event. You're going to having a great time, and I really do appreciate everyone attending. So thank you very much again.
Jim, it looks like we do have one question. Luna, I'm going to allow you to talk here. I'm going to unmute you and allow you to talk so you can ask your question if you'd like. You're going to have to unmute. I can't unmute you, so. Oh, she said she didn't mean to raise her hand. Okay.
Oh, okay. It's okay. Well, that's okay. Again, really, I hope that everyone has a great rest of the day. Again, thank you for attending. If you have any questions after the fact, please don't hesitate to reach out. I take the idea of mentoring and fostering a new generation extremely seriously. So anything I can do to help you out in your journey, I'm here for you. Okay, enjoy everyone. Take
Jim,
care.
I actually have a question for you. As someone who's been around since the early 90s and often see many of the things that you were talking about and these greatest challenges to those of us, I think you issued a very good call to action to everybody, with, you know, what you can do if you're new or what you can do if you've been around a while. But what do you think, you know, because a lot of us don't remember what it's like to be new in this, and we have to go back and remember what it's like to
Yeah.
get started. What do you think the biggest mistake that we often make when we're trying to mentor and can't put ourselves back in those shoes?
Yeah, I think most probably the biggest mistake or the biggest issue is that you said it perfectly. We forget what it's like to be new. We forget what it's like to be nervous about it, you know. And so, in a lot of ways, it's really incumbent upon us to like pull people in as well as expecting them to become more involved. So, you know, as people ask questions, dig a little bit deeper, you know, find out what it is that drove them. You know, hey, what was it that drove you to this particular, you know, open source project? Or if you're handling a GitHub issue or a bug report, hey, what situation are you using? Where did you hit, you know, find the way to make it personal, because that's what really this is about, is creating a personal connection with the people. So you have a personal community that makes, you know, that's the only way to really keep an open source project up and running. I always hate the idea, and we use it a lot, the whole idea about building a community, you know, and I as much as I understand that term, I don't like it, because like you build a chair, you build a desk, you build a concrete static structure that is dead. Whereas I prefer, like, you know, fostering a community or growing a garden, because that really implies what you're doing. And it's a continuing option. You know, you don't build it and then it's done. It's always ongoing. And I think that's something else that we need to remember as people who've been in here for a while, is that we need to keep things going. We need to meet things forward.
Oh, and Guy's popping up. Guy will be with you in just a moment. Guy's our next speaker. And I did have one other question for you, because we do see that we see people who get involved and have been involved for a long time, and either burnout hits them or they lose that enthusiasm, because it does seem like at times there is a fight, that revolution going on. Can you, with 2 minutes left, can you share a story that really kind of made you dig deeper and stay involved and stay excited and stay, you know, enthusiastic about open source?
Yeah,
Is there a point in time that happened for you?
I think there's been a number of points in time, you know, and you know, I just remember, I don't consider myself any big shakes, you know, at all. You know, I mean, there are a lot of people with a much deeper historical, you know, involvement with open source inside there. But I remember being at this one convention that I had a number of talks, and I remember, in fact, it was a All Things Open event, and it was when they were really focusing towards students and driving in the younger generation. And I remember this young woman, who I guess was maybe a freshman in college, attending all the sessions and being in like the first two rows and something like that. And I could tell that she was nervous about wanting to ask questions, as if I was some kind of whatever, you know. And just the very fact that she was nervous but wanted to know more. And I realized that this was an opportunity for me to get out of my comfort zone, because I'm actually, although it doesn't look like, somewhat, you know, reserved person, and to come out and say, hey, I noticed you were, you know, at some of these sessions, you know, how can I help you? You know, what drives you here? And just the very fact that there were people who you knew that just a little thing like that would make such a difference in their careers, and how often we just don't even notice when those opportunities pop up. I think that's most probably the biggest thing.
I think you have empowered a lot of people to continue their journey in open source, both from the
Thank you.
beginning and today. So thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
imparting wisdom and empowering us today.
Thank you.
And we look forward to more of your talks and seeing this recording. So thank you so much.
Anytime. You got it.